The colonel could no longer deny what he had uncovered. The folder on his desk was not simply a record, it was a mirror, and the reflection staring back at him was now walking among his soldiers disguised as a nameless worker. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a stone, because the longer her identity remained hidden, the more dangerous the situation became, yet exposing her could unleash consequences he was not prepared to face, so he waited for the right moment to confront her again. That moment arrived sooner than he expected. The sun had barely risen when he summoned her to his quarters. Once more, she entered without hesitation, standing in front of his desk, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The colonel gestured toward the folder, the code name visible in bold letters across the page. He told her he had read every line, that he had compared every detail to what he had seen with his own eyes. The maps, the precision, the silence, and that. The picture was complete. He asked her again if she was the sniper who had made the impossible shot. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes unblinking. Her face carved from stone, then she looked down at the folder and he saw a flicker, a brief shadow crossing her features. It was not fear but recognition, and that alone told him the answer he sought. She remained silent, and he realized she would not give him the satisfaction of words. Still, her silence spoke louder than any admission he could force from her. The colonel leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. He told her that the truth could not stay buried forever, that one day the soldiers in the camp would learn who she was, and that day would change everything he demanded too. Know why she hid behind silence. Why she chose to live among crates and magazines instead of carrying the respect her name should have commanded. She raised her eyes slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and steady. She told him that legends lived longer than names, that silence was a shield more powerful than recognition. She said the code name had become larger than flesh and blood, and if she claimed it openly, it would die with her. She said silence gave her freedom. Silence kept her enemies uncertain. Silence kept fear alive long after the bullet struck. The colonel listened and realized she was not hiding from weakness. She was protecting something far greater than herself. He wanted to argue, to demand more, but her gaze froze him in place. Her words carved themselves into his thoughts, and he knew she was right in ways he could not admit aloud. She turned then to leave, but he stopped her. His hand pressing against the folder, he told her that the truth was no longer his alone to keep. He told her that by entering his camp she had already set events into motion that would expose her whether she wanted it or not. Her silence was powerful, but silence could not hold against time. She paused at the doctor, her back straight. Her hand resting against the frame, she turned slightly, her voice carrying like a whisper yet striking like a hammer. She told him that when the moment came, he would understand why silence mattered, and why speaking the truth would destroy more than it saved. Then she stepped into the night, leaving him with those words echoing in the air. The next day, the camp seemed restless. Soldiers moved with unease, the whispers louder now than before. Men claimed the colonel had pressed her for answers. Men claimed she had admitted her past. Men claimed she had denied it all. No one agreed on the details, but all agreed on one thing. She was not who she appeared to be, and the mystery wrapped around her like smoke that only thickened with time. The colonel walked the camp with heavy steps, watching her from a distance. She continued her duties, stacking crates, recording numbers as though nothing had changed. Yet her silence now carried a sharper edge, as though she was waiting for something unseen. The soldiers around her moved cautiously, some avoiding her entirely. Others sneaking glances, as if daring themselves to see the legend hiding beneath her calm. That night the colonel returned to his quarters and stared at the folder, once more his mind circling the same thought over and over. She was the code name, she was the shot, she was the myth, and she was here in his camp wearing the disguise of routine. He wondered what force had brought her here. what mission she truly carried, what storm her silence was shielding them all from, and he realized with unease that the answer was close. The camp woke restless on the final morning, a strange tension humming in the air like the low vibration before thunder. The soldiers moved through their duties with clipped voices, their eyes darting toward the quiet woman who still stood among the crates stacking magazines and recording numbers, as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed, for the whispers had spread. Beyond rumor, they had become certainty. Though no one spoke it aloud, they all felt it. She was not who she seemed to be, and the colonel felt the same unease coiling in his chest. The colonel stood at the edge of the yard watching her, the folder still. Open on his desk, the code name written across the page. A code name that no longer felt like ink, but like a shadow. Alive within his camp, he remembered the maps in her notebook, the precision in her movements, the voice that had spoken only when necessary. And he knew now that silence was not absence. It was presence. It was the weight of what she carried. And the more he thought, the more he understood that her silence was not weakness. It was warning. That night, he found her again at the far end of the range, lying prone, though no target stood in the distance. The Barrett rifle rested in front of her, its barrel pointed toward the horizon, her cheek against the stock, her breath measured, slow and deliberate. She did not fire. She did not move. She simply watched the horizon through her scope as though waiting for a figure to step into place. The colonel crouched beside her and asked why she remained hidden, why she allowed whispers to define her when she could silence them with one word. She pulled her eye from the scope, turned her head and met his gaze, her voice quiet but steady. She told him that a record was nothing, a code name was nothing. What mattered was the silence that followed the shot. Silence that carried across mountains, and through camps silence that turned into fear. Stronger than any medal or recognition, the colonel listened and knew he could not argue, for in her eyes he saw the memory of the mountain, the wind, the patience, and the single moment that had changed everything. In the following days, her presence became heavier than ever. The soldiers fired their rifles with greater focus, their hands steadier, their breathing sharper, as though being near her demanded perfection. Yet they also avoided her eyes, avoided her shadow, for they felt the weight of something they could not name. They knew she had carried the code name. They knew she had taken the impossible shot, and though she never spoke the truth, her silence was enough to confirm what words could not. The camp became sharper, harder, more alert because of her. The colonel tried to write his report, but each word felt hollow. How could he reduce her to lines on paper? How could he capture the silence that defined her? The silence that made men whisper in the dark and stare at shadows with unease. He walked the perimeter each night and often found her already there, standing still at the ridge. The Barrett across her back, her figure carved against the stars. She seemed less like a soldier, and more like part of the landscape itself, a ghost anchored in silence. On the final night before the unit was scheduled to move out, he confronted her once more. Not as a commander, but as a man who had carried too many battles. He asked her if she would ever speak her truth, if she would ever claim her code name openly, or if she intended to remain a shadow forever. She looked at him with eyes that carried both frost and fire, and said only one thing. If I speak the name, the silence dies, and if the silence dies, the fear dies too. She turned and walked into the night, her step slow, her rifle steady at her side. The colonel did not follow. He watched her vanish into the darkness, knowing he would not stop her even if he could, for some truths were not meant to be spoken, and some legends lived longer when left in silence. By the time dawn came, she was gone, her tent empty, her presence erased as though she had never been there at all, except for the whispers that remained. Whispers of a code name that carried across the camp and beyond, whispers of a shot that had stretched 3,247 meters and still found its mark. The soldiers spoke in hushed tones, the number etched into their minds like scripture, and the colonel stood at the range alone, feeling the silence heavier than the thunder of any rifle. He realized then that the legend was no longer hers. Alone, it had become theirs. It had become his. It would travel with them across fields, across oceans spoken in whispers at firesides and barracks. The myth would grow. Not because she claimed it, but because she never did. And in that space between truth and silence, the story became immortal. The colonel lowered his head, his fists tight at his sides. He felt a chill, not from the wind, but from certainty. She was still out there somewhere waiting, watching, perhaps already lining up another impossible shot, and when that silence broke again, it would not be with words, but with the thunder of her rifle. The colonel knew the whispers were no longer harmless chatter. They had grown into something heavier, something that hung in the air like smoke from an unseen fire. He sat at his desk one night, turning pages of old files, each one stamped classified, each one filled with fragments of stories about missions no one admitted publicly. Missions carried out in silence across mountains, deserts, and forests. He traced the words with his finger, and in every account there was mention of a ghost, a sniper, a name never fully revealed, only a code name. As he read deeper, his mind returned to the woman outside counting magazines. Her face steady, her movements sharper than any clerk, her silence heavier than any words he could imagine. He wondered if the codename belonged to her, if the shadow in these pages stood now in his camp disguised as a quiet assistant. No record tied her here officially. She had no background that explained why she was assigned, yet her presence had been accepted without question, as though someone above him had slipped her into the roster unseen. The files spoke of shots taken at distances so impossible that commanders dismissed them as exaggerations 3 kilometers across valleys where wind and gravity ruled. Like kings, yet still the targets had fallen. The reports hinted at a woman trained in patience, trained to wait days without moving until her prey made one fatal mistake. Each line he read pulled him deeper until at last he closed the folder with unease pressing against his chest because he felt he was not reading myth, but a truth standing just outside his door. The next day he tested her again. He asked her directly about her past in front of 2 officers, hoping the pressure of an audience might shake her calm. She looked at him with steady eyes and answered only once. "I count what I am given, nothing more, nothing less." The officers laughed, thinking the colonel was chasing ghosts, but the colonel did not laugh. He saw how her eyes never wavered, how her shoulders never slumped, how even her silence carried the weight of someone used to interrogation. Later that night, as the camp settled into uneasy rest, he walked past her tent. He saw her seated on the ground, her notebook in her. Lapped the pencil, moving in deliberate lines. He stepped closer and caught sight of the page. Another map, drawn with sharp strokes, a range sketched in detail numbers marked carefully in the margins. She closed the book quickly, but not before he recognized. The outline, it matched the terrain described in the classified files, the same place where a record-breaking shot had been taken years ago. He returned to his quarters unsettled. His mind racing, he compared the memory of the sketch with the pages. In his folder, the lines were too precise, too deliberate. It was no coincidence, he realized then, that the woman was no ghost of rumor. She was flesh and blood, carrying a past that the military had buried under layers of silence. Yet here she was, counting magazines as if that could hide the shadow that followed her. He sat in the dark, unable to sleep, knowing the truth was closer than ever. The following morning he called her to his quarters. He laid the folder open on the desk, the code name. Bold across the page, the details of missions spread before them. He watched her eyes as they scanned the papers, waiting for some sign of recognition. She stood motionless at first. Then her gaze shifted. Her pupils tightened, her jaw set. But no words came. He pressed, Her asked if she had been there. If she had taken the shot, if she had carried the code name etched on the file, she said nothing. Her silence spoke louder than any confession. Her stillness was an admission. Her eyes betrayed what her lips concealed, and the colonel leaned back in his chair. Understanding at last that the legend was true, he wanted to ask more, wanted to demand names, places, numbers, but he felt the weight of her stare pressing him down, reminding him that some truths were meant to stay buried, that some silences were more dangerous than words. She left his quarters without speaking, without explaining, without defending herself. She walked back to her tent calm as ever, the folder still open on his desk. The colonel sat in the quiet room, his heart beating harder than it should his mind, repeating the same thought. She was the one. The code name was hers. The shot belonged to her, and now she was here in his camp, hidden in plain sight behind stacks of ammunition, and the disguise of ordinary duty. That night he did not sleep. He paced the room, his thoughts circling around the same questions. Why had she been sent here? Why hide her in such a place? Why cover her in silence instead of glory? He wondered if she had chosen this exile, or if someone had forced her into it. He knew only one thing for certain. The soldiers around him did not understand the danger of what they joked about. They thought she was a ghost or a mute clerk, but she was a storm disguised as calm. The morning sun rose over the camp, casting long shadows across the gravel and steel. The soldiers moved through their routines with the same noise and rhythm as always, but the colonel felt a weight pressing down on his shoulders. The folder with the code name remained on his desk, its pages staring back at him like ghosts, whispering what he already knew. Yet refused to admit out loud. He stepped outside, and his eyes immediately found her moving between crates. Her pace steady, her silence unbroken, as though nothing had changed, but he knew everything had changed. He decided to approach her, not with questions hidden in shadows, but with direct confrontation. He walked across the yard, ignoring the curious glances of soldiers who paused. At the sight of their commander heading toward the quiet woman who had become the source of so many rumors, he stopped in front of her and spoke her supposed name clearly, but her gaze did not flicker. She kept her hands on the crate in front of her, as if waiting for him to say what he had really come to say. The colonel leaned closer and asked her if she knew the code name in the file, if she had carried it into battle years ago, if she had pulled the trigger on the shot that was said to be impossible for a human hand to take. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that froze him in place. She said nothing yet again, but her silence was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of choice, and it cut deeper than words could have. He stepped back, but his resolve only hardened. The soldiers nearby laughed at the sight of the colonel questioning her. They believed their commander was wasting time on a woman who barely spoke, who barely acknowledged. Them who seemed no more important than the stacks of ammunition she counted. They joked under their breath that the colonel must be bored, that he must be losing his edge. But the colonel knew he was not chasing shadows. He was staring into the face of a legend, wearing a mask of quiet routine. That night, he called her into his quarters again, the folder still open on the table. He pointed to the code name printed in bold black letters. He recited the details of the mission, the weather, the terrain, the distance, 3,247 meters a target, eliminated in one shot. He demanded to know if she was there. If the silence she carried was the silence of that rifle echoing across valleys. She stood unmoving, her eyes fixed. On the folder, her jaw tight, her hands folded behind her back. The colonel pressed harder, his voice low but sharp. He told her he had studied too many files, too many maps. He had seen her sketches. He had seen the precision in her movements. He knew she was not who she pretended to be. He told her the camp deserved to know who walked among them. He told her she could not remain a shadow forever. At last, she raised her eyes from the folder and looked directly at him. a gaze so steady it felt, like a rifle scope resting on his chest. When she spoke, her words were quiet, yet they filled the room. She told him that silence was stronger than recognition. Silence kept enemies guessing. Silence allowed myths to grow larger than the truth. She said a name could be erased, but silence endured long after the bullet struck. The colonel listened, frozen by the calm certainty in her voice. He realized then that her silence was not fear. It was power, and that power was why she had survived missions. Meant to erase her, he wanted to argue, but her eyes silenced him more than her words. She turned and walked out of his quarters, leaving the folder still open, leaving him staring at the code name that no longer felt like ink on a page, but like a living shadow inside his camp. He sat there long after she was gone, struggling with the choice before him to expose her or to protect her, knowing that either path carried weight that could break him. The next morning, the camp carried on as if nothing had happened. The soldiers joked, laughed, argued, trained. But beneath the surface, the tension grew. The whispers about her reached every corner of the yard. Some claimed the colonel had demanded answers, and she had given none. Others said she had spoken, and admitted the truth. Though no one knew what the truth was, the whispers twisted into myths, and the myths spread faster than any order he could give. The colonel walked the perimeter restless, his thoughts consumed by her presence. He wondered why. She had been placed here, if this was her punishment or her choice. He wondered if she carried the silence to protect herself or to shield those around her from a truth they were not ready to face. And he realized with unease that the answer might come not through words but through events beyond his control. As the sun dipped low, he caught sight of her standing at the far end of the yard, her figure outlined against the fading light, the Barrett rifle nowhere in sight, yet the image of her, holding it, filled his mind. He knew the silence she carried could not last forever. Something was coming, something that would shatter the mask and reveal the truth, not just to him, but to everyone in the camp. She walked quietly through the dusty camp, moving like a shadow between the crates of ammunition and the stacks of magazines, her boots hardly making a sound against the ground. The soldiers around her barely spared a glance. She was just another figure in a place full of noise, orders, laughter, and the clatter of rifles. Her hands moved quickly, sorting, counting, stacking, as though this was all she had ever done. Yet every motion carried precision, far too sharp for the simple task before her. And the colonel noticed, though he said nothing at first. The men joked that she had the dullest assignment in the entire base, to sit among steel boxes and cardboard cases counting magazines until her eyes blurred. But she never complained, never laughed, never groaned about the work. Instead, she moved with a quiet patience, her eyes flicking toward the barracks, toward the towers, toward the distant gate, each glance as brief as a breath, yet sharp enough to suggest she was measuring everything around her, and the colonel caught this more than once. At night, when most of the camp turned to rest, she remained among the crates, still sorting, still writing in a small notebook, her pencil scratching against paper. No one dared to read when one of the soldiers asked her why she worked so late. She offered no answer, only a faint smile that held no warmth, and then she returned to her task, her silence growing heavier than the chatter around the fire. The colonel from his own tent watched this scene through the thin flap, and his suspicion began to stir. Her uniform bore no marks of rank. Her name tape faded, her insignia missing. It seemed as though she was no one yet. Her posture betrayed her secret each time she bent to lift a case of ammunition. Her knees aligned perfectly, her spine straightened. Her breathing measured each movement, fluid like a drill that had been repeated 1,000 times, and no one trained themselves so carefully for something as simple as carrying crates. This fact pressed upon the colonel, though he kept his thoughts hidden. During the day, she continued the same rhythm, stacking magazines, handing them off to squads who rushed out for field practice. The young recruits teased her behind her back, calling her the quartermaster ghost, saying she had no voice and no purpose. But when they reached for their supplies, she always knew exactly how many rounds each man needed. She never checked the list. She never asked. She simply handed them the correct count. And when questioned about how she knew her silence returned heavier than before, it was then that the colonel began testing her. He deliberately altered the lists, changed the numbers, added false requests he sent soldiers to her with errors built into their forms. Yet every time she corrected them without hesitation, she slid the false papers aside, gave the exact right count, and her eyes lifted only once to meet the colonel standing in the distance. It was a glance sharp and unflinching. And in that instant, the colonel understood she was not simply counting, she was observing, she was calculating. On the 5th day of her quiet presence, a sudden alert rattled the camp. A convoy returning early with wounded men, the yard filled with shouting as stretchers rushed past. Yet even in that chaos, she did not falter. Her hands flew across the crates preparing supplies, bandages, ammunition, water. Everything in neat bundles handed off without pause, as though she had already known the emergency was coming, and the colonel who helped direct the men noticed her calm and knew no simple assistant could remain so steady in that storm. When night fell again, the colonel walked the perimeter and found her sitting by the fence, her rifle. Nowhere in sight, only a small knife in her hand. She scraped it slowly against a stone, sharpening the edge, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the wire. He asked her why she carried no firearm, and she looked up at him with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the night. Then she returned to the blade without a word. The silence stretched, and the colonel left with unease, pressing at his chest. The soldiers still laughed in the mornings, still called her names, still tossed her scraps of conversation that she never answered yet. Some began to notice the way their own laughter faded when her eyes passed over them. They began to notice how often she stood near exits, how often she walked the yard at hours, when most slept. And though they did not speak it aloud, they too began to wonder what role she truly played and why she stayed so close to their weapons. The colonel kept his doubts within, but his mind churned each day, building a picture of someone who did not belong to the simple work she performed, someone who carried a past that reached beyond the camp walls, a past that perhaps none of the men around him could imagine. And as he watched her one last time that night with the moonlight falling across her steady face, he realized the truth was closer than he had first thought, yet still out of reach. The whispers began to travel quietly through the camp, carried on low voices during meals and muttered conversations in the barracks. The soldiers first spoke of how she moved differently than the rest, how her eyes seemed to never rest in one place too long, how even when her hands busied themselves with ammunition, her gaze measured people like targets. No one admitted it outright, but each man who watched her for too long felt something sharp press against his thoughts, as though she was not merely present but studying him. One evening, a pair of recruits walked past her storage tent and saw her cleaning the parts of a rifle. Not one assigned to her. Not one she should have had at all. She dismantled it with such ease that the two stopped in their tracks, too, startled to say a word. Her fingers moved with confidence, as if every spring and pin belonged to her. She looked up once, saw them, and without a word placed the weapon back together, handed it to them in perfect order, and returned to her stack of magazines, leaving the recruits stunned and silent. By the next morning, the rumors spread faster. The recruits told their squad leaders, who added their own suspicions, stories of her precise movements during drills, of how she always took cover near corners or doorways, of how she seemed to know when someone was about to enter a room before the sound of boots touched the floor. These stories traveled until even the older soldiers spoke of her with quiet unease, yet still they dismissed her presence with jokes, calling her a clerk with combat boots, a ghost in uniform. The colonel heard the whispers as well. He never acknowledged them, but his interest grew. He began observing her more deliberately, watching how she never stumbled, how her stride carried discipline. how she ate alone at the far edge of the mess tent, never rushing, never speaking. The men said she was mute. Others said she was hiding a scar that stole her voice, but the colonel knew better. He saw how she responded with silence, not from weakness, but from choice. Silence had weight, and she carried it like a weapon. Late one night, the colonel entered the supply tent, under the guise of checking inventory. She stood there alone, her notebook open, her pencil, scratching across a page filled, not with numbers, but with drawings, small maps, rough outlines of terrain, hills, trees, and sight lines. He froze in the shadows, watching as she marked distances with careful lines, her head tilting slightly, as though recalling not figures on a page but landscapes she had once walked. He stepped forward, and she shut the notebook instantly, sliding it into her pocket without, breaking her calm stare. He asked what she was writing, and she answered nothing. Her voice low and controlled, the first time he had ever heard her speak. The sound was not soft, but measured, the kind of tone carried by someone who did not waste words. It sent a shiver through him, because it was the voice of someone used to giving commands, not requests. He nodded, pretending not to notice, but the sound lingered with him long into the night, reminding him that silence had been her shield and speech was her blade. The following days only fueled the whispers. One soldier swore he had seen her trace bullet holes on a target, with her fingertips nodding as if measuring the spread. Another said she corrected his grip on a rifle during practice, with such authority that he obeyed without question, before realizing she should not have known at all. And another claimed she disappeared into the perimeter woods for hours, only to return with her uniform dusty, her boots carrying the scent of soil and pine, though no one dared ask what she had been doing. The colonel began collecting these pieces like fragments of a puzzle, forming an image that disturbed him more. Each day he remembered the files he had studied years before. Code names, whispered like myths, identities hidden behind layers of secrecy. He wondered if she was connected to one of those shadows from the past. Yet each time he approached her, the mask never slipped. She remained the quiet figure, counting magazines, stacking crates and recording numbers as if nothing else existed. Still, the soldiers grew restless. The weight of suspicion gnawed at them during drills. Some began avoiding her tent. Others lingered near it as if daring themselves to uncover her secret, and the colonel knew this tension could not last forever. Something would break, whether by accident or design. He felt it in his bones. The camp had become too aware of her silence, too aware of the sharpness that hid beneath the surface. One night, while the camp settled into uneasy rest, the colonel sat in his quarters, staring at his desk, his thoughts circling around the woman outside. He thought of the maps in her notebook, the precise way she moved, the measured voice that had cut through silence, like a blade, and he realized that she was no ghost, no quartermaster, no nameless clerk. She was something else, something trained for shadows and distance, something that had no place sorting crates of magazines. He rose, fro.